Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Matt Kibbe, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Austrian Economic Center and author of Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff, a Libertarian Manifesto. Matt, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you, Bill.
Matt, you're something of a bellwether for disaffected voters increasingly abandoning the Democratic and Republican parties. You helped found FreedomWorks in 2004, which became a rallying point for Tea Party activists, and moved on to Concerned American Voters, which supported Rand Paul's primary efforts until he dropped out of the race. Last time we talked, you were pondering your next move and reflecting on a political climate I'd like to ask you about. Here we are less than 8 months from the next presidential election, and the leading candidate for the Republican nomination is not really a Republican, and the surging challenger for the Democratic nomination is not a Democrat. Students flocked to Ron Paul and his libertarian message when he ran for president, and now they're flocking to Bernie Sanders and his diametrically opposed socialist message. What the heck is going on?
You know, it's interesting. I think a lot of voters are now waking up to the potential that we may, in fact, have to choose between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in November, which sounds insane, and it sounds even more insane for me to suggest that I'm more optimistic than ever about the potential for liberty and the values of liberty and the ideas of liberty to connect with a much larger audience. And I think the fact that Republican and Democratic politics and party bosses are freaking out right now is an indication of something very positive. The old top-down monopolies that have controlled information, products, services, and even politics are falling apart. And to me, the question is, what do we do with that?
So, Matt, what are the actual numbers right now? What percent of the electorate can the Democrats and Republicans actually claim each as their hardcore?
Well, the trend is towards independence. In 44 out of 50 states, there's now more registered independents than there are either Republicans or Democrats. And I think that's interesting. The old theory about independence, that they're sort of half and half, or they're sort of apathetic in the middle, has nothing to do with what's going on. I think voters are being savvy shoppers, and they're realizing that the old Republican versus Democrat choice is a lot like going to a shopping mall today in Caracas. There's nothing on the shelves. And if you do find something on the shelf, you don't want to buy it. So the way that the world works today is very a la carte. And that, to me, is the ultimate libertarian world, where we create our own realities, we choose our products and services. And I think in politics, more and more voters are wanting to treat choices as a basket of goods. And they like some things that they hear from Bernie Sanders, they like some things that they hear from Rand Paul, but they're not ready to just sign on with this package deal that is Republican or Democrat.
But on Election Day, you got to pull one lever. You don't vote for a package. Does this imply that politics is going to become more and more unstable as people rush from one side of the boat to the other side of the boat until it capsizes?
I think what you'll see, and I've been predicting something like this for years, there's a lot of reasons why we have a two-party system. There's a lot of laws and regulations that make it very difficult for third parties to compete and participate. But the world and social media and the internet is basically breaking up the old rules. It used to be that name ID and the money bundlers that you knew and endorsements from party poobahs in Washington, they really defined who was going to be the presidential candidate for the party. And you're seeing today that you can raise money online, you can organize people outside of the formal party structure. And I'm going to suggest that we're getting closer and closer to a world where there will be more choices in politics, and choices that are more consistent with your personal values as opposed to what the DNC says.
But we've got the two extremes with Trump and Sanders. You know, Trump's a billionaire. He's funding his own campaign. Sanders looks to be a genuine grassroots politician. And all that PAC money is being burned on bonfires going to waste. So, you know, what good does it do to have all these choices when it comes to where to put your money?
Well, I think the difference is that it used to be max donors bundling for particular candidates, sort of the Jeb Bush model. And even a couple years ago, Jeb Bush would already be the Republican nominee, much like his brother wrapped up the nomination early in 2000. But Bernie Sanders, of course, like Ron Paul before him, like Rand Paul in his Senate race, like a number of these really interesting Tea Party candidates that have won over the years. They're raising small dollar donations from a more democratized donor base. I think that's empowering, and I think more people should participate in the process. And part of that is writing a $25 check.
So we're creating more competition using the internet in the political marketplace, but the internet also does other things. Look how it's empowering governments to become even more intrusive in our lives when it comes to surveillance. Look at the fight between Apple and the FBI. Are we heading towards a surveillance state using the same technology that's creating political competition?
This is like the monumental clash of our time. And in one sense, the internet is this wildly liberating device that creates what cyber libertarian John Perry Barlow calls the right to know. We now can Google it. We now can create our own communities. We can set up our RSS feed so that we don't literally have 3 TV networks telling us what to think, versus the very granular ability of government snoops now to target us, to focus us, to scoop up our data, all of these issues that we're fighting against. I suggest that in that clash, liberty is going to win, because it's very difficult to stop free people with these new tools. And they're going to try. You see it every day. They're trying to clamp down on speech. They're trying to clamp down on choice and freedom. But it didn't work in the Arab Spring. It certainly didn't work when the IRS targeted the Tea Party movement. And I think that's a bellwether for something far more radical and disruptive that's coming.
Well, it's one thing to be optimistic. It's another to look at the fight on the ground. I'd like to ask you about Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, which has really become sort of a how-to manual for the progressive movement. Aren't we seeing this really flowering in the age of the internet in terms of the way they use social media to demonize opponents, control the narrative, and separate a conversation from fact?
It's both, right? So you have this almost brutal internet shaming of anyone that progressives don't support that can be quite devastating to people's reputations. But you also have a chance to fight back. And I think in the old world where the New York Times decided whether or not you were a good guy or a bad guy, and you were not a well-funded opponent that could buy your own TV ads, you pretty much were a victim before the conversation started. In a decentralized world, you can fight back. And I think about it very much in a Hayekian sense, where you have the ability to crowdsource knowledge and information in a way that has got to be closer to truthiness than it was when somebody decided what the truth was on the evening news.
And yet there's no closure. People are simultaneously heroes and villains. Facts are simultaneously true and false, and there's no resolution to it. Everything keeps reverberating on the internet. What does that imply?
It implies that the market is a process, and we live in a world of radical uncertainty, and the discovery of new things and getting to new solutions is a never-ending thing. We got to engage in this, and I think this points to the strategy moving forward. The old ways that people that believed in liberty conveyed things through white papers and through really smart guys speaking from behind a lectern about their version of the truth, that's got to be replaced with engaging in this wild social media conversation that's really driven by 140 characters on Twitter, 30-second videos, really engaging in that process in a way that I think directs people to our ideas instead of the Alinskyites who really create false caricatures to demonize their enemies.
But on that playing field, the winner is the person who could tell the best story, not necessarily the one who could make the best argument. And progressives on the left are just better storytellers.
Oh, they sure are. And that's I think, something that I learned from Alinsky when we were pouring through all of this leftist literature 25 years ago, long before Barack Obama made Saul Alinsky famous. The left is very good at narrative, and we're talking about downward sloping demand curves in the non-aggression principle. And
Right.
it's a little surprised that we've been losing that. But let's admit that we've gotten it wrong so far and figure out how to do it right.
Matt, let's swing around to one particular portion of the electorate, which is millennials, the young people. You've stated that millennials are searching for a political home. How will they know when they found one?
In one sense, they've come to the realization that the political establishment is their enemy, that they're getting screwed every which way from Sunday. I remember reading an interview with one of the young women at an Occupy Wall Street rally, and she was complaining about Wall Street bailouts. And she was asking, where's my bailout? She had a lot of student debt. And once they realize that the game is rigged, they can go one or two ways. They can say, you know what, I'm going to play the same game, and I'm going to line up at the trough just like everybody else. But I think the alternative universe is the one that they actually live in, where they curate everything. They curate their music. They curate their friends. They curate how they associate with other institutions within society. They even curate how they replace their cab monopoly with an Uber. And to me, that is the ultimate libertarian world where people choose everything. And this is particularly true with young people. They don't wait for the guy behind the podium to tell them what to think. They Google it. And I think in that world, the ideas of liberty have better standing. But part of the challenge is our language. And I'm looking at all these young kids celebrating socialism today. When they say that, they're not talking about the government ownership of the means of production socialism that you and I know. They think socialism means people working together to solve problems.
Yeah.
And the left has been very good at corrupting our language. They think community is the equivalent to a government program. They think that liberal means more government involvement, when you and I know that the technical definition of liberal is freedom and free enterprise and people coming together in voluntary association.
Well, let's look at one element of the so-called success of democratic socialism, and that's Social Security and entitlements. We baby boomers are leaving millennials a hell of a mess when it comes to these unfunded entitlements. Why aren't young people rebelling against entitlements instead of demanding more? I mean, who do they think is going to end up paying for them?
I think part of our challenge, going back to the question of narrative, is we've been talking about unfunded liabilities, and we've been publishing spreadsheets showing the unsustainability of entitlement programs. And I think a better approach would be one based on choice. Why is it that you are forced into these programs, even though you could probably do better for yourself? And remember, this is a generation that chooses everything. I remember when George W. Bush was trying to pass Social Security reform, the primary objection from the Democrats and the left was that people couldn't possibly make that many choices. Well, that argument's not going to fly anymore. I think we make an argument about empowerment, an argument about the individual, as opposed to our typical bankruptcy, this is unsustainable thing, because it just doesn't. It's not a compelling story, and I don't think young people think about the world that way yet. At some point, when they're dealing with their family budgets and they're dealing with marginal tax rates and they're trying to pay their bills, those arguments are potentially more compelling, but at that point, they'll already be stuck with a system that's not going to pay them out.
How come arguments based on examples don't work? Why can't we point to Greece and Venezuela and say, socialism, look?
Bernie Sanders would point to Norway. And it's kind of an interesting example he uses, because Norway and a lot of Scandinavia has been moving away from socialism as you and I would understand it. They've liberalized their markets. They've allowed for more competition. And of course, they benefit greatly from oil revenue. And I see that Bernie Sanders is anti-fossil fuels, and I wonder how he heads that up. But we don't, it is frustrating that these examples haven't worked so far, and we'll have to figure that out.
When you talk about realpolitik, how do you think Bernie Sanders' young supporters will react if the Clinton machine steals the nomination by, say, using the power of the convention's superdelegates to outvote the elected delegates?
Oh, I think it'll be beautiful chaos. I think you're already seeing A lot of these young Bernie Sanders activists realize that the whole superdelegate process is the ultimate insider ploy to choose the candidate under the pretense that grassroots actually has a say. I'd love to see that revolution, and I think you're seeing the same thing on the Republican side. The Republicans, of course, at the 2012 convention tried to regame the rules of the game so that Ron Paul activists were disenfranchised and Tea Party activists were disenfranchised. And look what it got them. A lot of those same activists are now saying, you know what, the system is so corrupt, I'm going with Donald Trump.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be funny if Bernie Sanders supporters were driven into Trump's arms?
So I think anything's possible. There's such a crisis of legitimacy in our current political process. I think people are looking for answers, and that's both the potential of upside is huge, but it's also a dangerous time. I think if you're going to get an outcome where voters get to choose between a fascist and a socialist, something's wrong. Something is dangerously wrong.
Matt, the fight to limit the power of government is often 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. FreedomWorks, a group you helped found, ended up imploding on you in a true house of cards fashion. What did you learn from that, and what advice do you have as we contemplate the post-Obama age?
Well, I think what I learned at FreedomWorks was the power of the political establishment. FreedomWorks ultimately fell victim to GOP insiders that didn't like the fact that we had successfully replaced establishment Republicans with a new generation of senators, guys like Mike Lee, who is as close to a classical liberal statesman as you will ever find in American politics, and of course Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and a number of others as well.
And Justin Amash.
And Thomas Massey. And you have in the House and Senate what I call the Liberty Caucus. There's technically a Liberty Caucus, but it's much larger than that. In American history, and I would go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, you've never had such a powerful block of libertarianish, classical liberal, small government conservative senators and congressmen, and they have already radically disrupted the process. And I think FreedomWorks didn't have a unanimous commitment to continue down that path. But to me, this is just the classic fight between Washington insiders and the American people. And I think moving forward, the answer has got to be figuring out how to connect with the next generation. How do we connect with young people who know that the Republicans and the Democrats are inherently corrupt? A lot of them were intrigued by Rand Paul, but some of them were caucusing with Bernie Sanders. I think this is our moment to talk in a nonpartisan way, even in a transpartisan way, finding places where we can agree with the left, honest progressives, on questions like criminal justice reform, on questions like drug policy, on questions like mass surveillance. And if you'll notice, all of these places where we genuinely agree with thoughtful people on the left are narratives, are stories about the abuse of government power, about too much centralization, about too much presumption of knowledge by supposedly well-meaning people in Washington, D.C.
Wasn't Ralph Nader attempting something similar?
He was, and that was a different era. But I would suggest that there's some commonalities there on subjects that you wouldn't expect. And I think mass incarceration is a great example of this. This is the product of federal legislation that tried to dictate from the top down how local judges would sentence young, nonviolent drug offenders. And the net result is disastrous.
Yeah.
And everybody agrees with this. Everybody that's not a vested interest understands that we have to reverse this. But it's not a story about the failures of capitalism. It's a story about a failure of government.
So, Matt, where do we go from here? Where do you go from here?
I think we have to appreciate that politics is a lagging indicator of social change, and we have to look upstream from this election to figure out what needs to happen next. I want to talk to young people. I want to tell stories about liberty and empowerment and opportunity. And I think that's more cultural ultimately than it is politics. Certainly there's legislative fights. Certainly people pay attention to presidential politics, and you should leverage those opportunities. But let's get into the culture, and let's try to crowdsource exactly the kind of community that can have an impact, that share ideas, that can grow in understanding of liberty. And I'm preparing to launch a new organization called Free the People that's going to do a series of experiments with video, with social media, engaging this young millennial generation that is more independent than Republican or Democrat.
And where do we go to find Free the People? Have you set anything up yet we can follow?
freethepeople.org should be set up any day now.
Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show. We're going to be keeping an eye on you. Keep in touch.
Appreciate it, Bill.
That was Matt Kibbe on the cusp of launching his next effort to help save democracy from self-destruction. Here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.